Hi there, I'm back from holiday and I've crashed right back into work straight away, commentating live on the Aimchess Rapid Tournament, the latest online tournament in the Champions Chess Tour. There's a great lineup. Well, Magnus Carlsen, Wesley So, Levon Aronian, and so on. It's very, very strong. But I want to focus on a game between Awonder Liang, 18-year-old prodigy from the States, playing Vidit Gujrathi from India. And we have a queen and pawn endgame. This is move 98. Really tough to defend these kind of positions, but so far in this game, Awonder Liang has done very well indeed, and it is really hard for black to make progress because that king, well, it's just very exposed. It hasn't got shelter, so it's very hard to advance this pawn because that would just expose the king. But here, well, after already many moves, Awonder makes a mistake. He should just play a delicate move with the queen just to stop the king coming forward. But he gives a check. And then gives another check. And another check. But actually that king is now in an excellent position. And queen f4. And now this pawn is dropping. It's tough to defend these positions. I have to say, I think queen and pawn endgames are my least favourite endgame. Whether I'm defending or whether I'm, have the advantage. I think they're so difficult to calculate with all these checks and, well, much more than that. There are some very devilish traps too. So let's see. Now this should be a winning position for black with two extra pawns. Let's see what Vidit did. Well, here, I mean, one of the techniques of winning queen and pawn endgames is to transpose down into a winning pawn endgame. So that's what you're looking at the whole time. So here, the obvious move to look at for black is to play queen g3 check. But this just winds up in a drawn king and pawn endgame. You can see black's king can't shoulder away white's king, so white has the opposition, and this is just a theoretical draw. White's king's in the perfect position. So Vidit here, well, he calculated, didn't have much time to calculate. Players were playing on something like around about 30 seconds each, getting 10 seconds each time they make a move, but they really didn't have that much time to think. But Vidit calculated that h3 check was a winning move. Now here is where it gets very interesting. So let's look at the possibilities. First of all, well, what happens if that pawn is taken with the king? Well, now black can transpose down into a winning pawn endgame. Takes king g3, king e4, and of course this one is very different because white's king is going to be barged out of the way. The king gets in front of the pawn and black wins the opposition. Well, we'll see what happens with queen takes in a second. What happens if the king just retreats? Well, black is making significant progress now. The king comes forward and this is going to be winning. Just f5. Remember, if the queen checks here, that's going to be queen f3, exchanging queens. This is a winning position for black. Not too difficult. So after h3, what happened? Well, Awonder took that pawn and Vidit just thought he was winning with queen g4 check, because if the queens are exchanged, again, black wins the opposition, can force the king out of the way, and the pawn will go through. So Awonder played queen g3. So hanging tough here. So if the queens are exchanged, then again, white has gained the opposition, and that's a draw. But Vidit, of course, had seen this far and thought he was winning with this move, king f5. This is very delicate, assuming that, well, the queens should be exchanged and it must be a draw. or if the king steps away, then here, and black wins. And it seems like there's no other move. Of course, this is winning as well for black. Black again has the opposition. But Awonder found a miracle defense. This is fantastic. King h1. Stalemate is a theme that recurs so often in queen endgames. So, of course, if that's taken, that is stalemate. So Vidit had given up one of his extra pawns, and now this is a fairly simple draw. Lots of checks, although this is move 109. It wasn't until move 159 that Vidit actually gave up his winning attempt, but I'm not going to torment you with all 159 moves of this game, but basically there were lots of checks and Vidit really didn't make any progress. Let's come back to this position. This is the critical moment because, in fact, so here is where king f5 was played and king h1 draws for white. But in fact, Vidit did have a win in this position. Can you spot it? What is black's win? In fact, if he'd moved his king the other way, king h5, this is a winning position. Okay, what's the difference? Well, once again, if the queens are exchanged, then black is just winning. Okay, so what happens if the king goes in the corner? Isn't this just stalemate again? Well, yes, of course, if queen takes queen, it's stalemate. But black has a win here with queen h4 check. That's why the king has to come to h5 to support this. If the queens are exchanged, black wins the opposition and wins. And if king g2, again, black can enter the pawn endgame because this time it's white to move and black wins. There we go. Incredible. So just one tiny misstep from Vidit and he couldn't clinch the win. King h5 is a winning move, but king f5, well, that is very alert from Awonder Liang right at, well, not quite the end of the game, but on move 109. Great resourcefulness from him. Unfortunately, he didn't have a great tournament. He finished at the bottom of the pile of the 16 players. But hopefully, well, games like this will give him some confidence. Curious enough, in the very next round, in the game between Carlsen and Duda, there was another queen and pawn endgame. Let's have a look at this position. Again, queen and two pawns against queen. This time it's a g pawn and not an f pawn. In fact, in some ways the g pawn makes it more difficult for white because with an f pawn, the king actually gets better cover. With the g pawn, it's not so easy. So Carlsen with the white pieces, move 106, and here Carlsen played king h5, and, well, perhaps you know the response by now, Duda played queen f7 check. Same tactic. Like I said, it's very common. If queen takes queen, then that is stalemate. So Carlsen came back with king g4, and there were lots of checks, and, well, basically, well, with best play, it's probably a draw, this position, actually. Although, well, if you feed this into a table base, then with every move, the assessment was swinging between draw and win. I mean, it is so difficult to determine what the best moves are in this kind of position. It's still very tricky for both sides. But the funny thing is that in this position, well, I'll go a few moves on. This is 121. And here, the computer automatically declared a draw. Carlsen had repeated the position for the third time. He was disgusted. He was really mad with himself for allowing a 3-4 repetition. Well, really hard to remember which positions are on the board because we haven't been repeating this position in the last few moves. In fact, this position had occurred way back. I mean, dozens of moves ago. So Carlsen simply didn't have it in his head, but he was kicking himself. I'm going to go back. This is move 124, but I'm going to go back to move 69. And you can see, well, Carlsen in the intervening period managed to advance these pawns. But here is where Carlsen played king g2. Again, I mean, such a difficult position to play in any form of chess, but in rapid play, well, impossible to get it right. But here, like I said, Carlsen played king g2, but I think I want to show you a move which I think is quite instructive, and I think gives a clue as to how one should perhaps play this position. h6 is a clearer move. So this leaves the pawn back here, and as I mentioned previously, in queen and pawn endgames, a lot of the time it's about transposing down into a pawn endgame. This is what you have to have in mind the whole time. So after h6, of course, the threat is to checkmate. So black has a couple of responses. He can obviously defend the mate with queen d7, or he can start checking like crazy. Well, in fact, checking like crazy will just drive the king up the board. Very difficult to determine in an actual game when you're running short of time whether the king can escape, but actually the king can escape. Let's come back to this position and have a look at queen d7, because actually those lines kind of transpose. So the king marches up the board. King here. Now, if the queen just waits, let's say queen d7, here we can transpose into the pawn endgame. Because the pawn is on g4, not g5, then the king can step in front and win the opposition, winning position for white. So instead of waiting, black has to check. So basically we've transposed into the line I mentioned earlier. And here, well, we can wait. In this case, the pawn endgame is a draw. This time it's white to move. You can't force the black king out. Okay, so white plays king h5. Well, now this is a threat. Now it's a threat. So, for example, queen here, check, here. This time it's black's move. White wins. So black has to start checking. And the queen comes back to c7. Of course, if queen e5, then queen g5 check wins the pawn endgame there. So queen c7, queen g5, king here, doesn't matter where the king goes because queen g7 is going to be our next move. And king g5 with a winning position because black has to move the king out of the way. Delicate steps, but that is very often a key, that you use one pawn to go forward and you leave that one as far behind as possible so that the king can actually step up and come in front of the pawn to win a pawn endgame. Still not so clear, you know, very delicate steps required. Anyway, Carlsen and Duda, I mean, in a sense, the result of this game was irrelevant because Carlsen and Duda both finished in the top half of the tournament and qualified for the knockout stage. And in fact, they will be playing in one of the quarterfinals. So do check out the tournament. I'll be commentating live, not today, but later in the week. I'll be commentating live. Do join me on Chess24 for that. And yeah, more videos coming your way as soon as I get back into the swing of my working routine. Thanks for watching.